Welcome to another episode of Federal Data Talk, the podcast where we dive deep into the rapidly changing world of data, especially in the public sector. With your host, me, Stephen Cole, an Azure DoD specialist at Microsoft Federal. Let's jump right in. But before we get started, got to satisfy the legal folks. Hit it.
The content provided in this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. The opinions expressed herein belong solely to the individual host or guest and do not represent those of any other person or entity. All rights reserved. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including recording, photocopying, or other electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written permission of the publisher, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical reviews and certain other non-commercial uses permitted by copyright law. For permission requests, DM the publisher on X, Federal Data Talk. The information in this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice. Listeners should not act upon any information provided in this podcast without seeking professional counsel.
Hey, well, welcome. We've got some time here today with one of our guests. I'm not going to put words in her mouth here. So, Carley Salmon, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk about data.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, data is an interesting topic. I love your I guess the position that you get put in as a security specialist. Well, actually, before I do that, tell these people who are listening. Most of the people who are going to be listening are, they work with the DoD or they have done some government contracts before, and so they've heard of data. Maybe not necessarily as familiar with cloud or all things Azure related. But if they are, they probably have some questions about security. They may not be as familiar, though, with what it is that you do or how you help some of our government customers.
Yeah, sure. So Carley Salmon, I'm a compliance technical specialist, but really kind of better named as a data security technical specialist. So everything data, really, I focus kind of on the M365 side of the house, but how that fits into Azure is definitely important for when we talk about the things that Microsoft Purview, because that's the data security suite of tools, and how that kind of fits into the Azure workloads or the Azure, security space and what that means. But I've been in this position for a little over a year.
Okay.
There's only two of us for the entire DoD. And four of us across the entire federal space. So I don't want to say it's a new position, but it was, still kind of fairly new-ish from siphoning out data security specifically. But prior to coming to Microsoft, I worked in the cyber compliance space as a cyber auditor for the DoD of their government contractors. So
wow,
what we call the DIB, the Defense Industrial Base, I used to assess their cyber compliance in accordance with their contracts with DoD. So coming over here, I've used a lot of that in what I do day to day. And a lot of those customers that I assessed, I work with now.
Wow.
On their data security journey. So it's kind of a neat kind of full circle piece to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I kind of want to back up even just a second before we get down the path of Purview here. So I may put you on the spot. Whenever it comes to auditing some of the DIB customers and you come across them now, do you have to ask some difficult questions to answer because of what you discovered during the audit process, or do you? So,
with some of it's interesting because some of the customers that I have now, I assessed 4 or 5 years ago.
Sure.
And so they remember me. And they're like, oh, that's how I know her. And so there's already kind of this relationship. And sometimes maybe I learned things that would have, not been good for me, good for me to know now, helping them on a data security journey. But I might have assessed them a little bit differently if I knew that then.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's interesting being an assessor, especially kind of coming in from the government to these companies, especially some of the larger ones who have very robust cyber programs.
Sure.
And, validating, verifying, justifying that we are capable to be there. But then also, we're not trying to find any gotchas. We're trying to work with you because obviously you do important work for the government. And it's just now that the government's finally catching up to validate parts of the contract clauses that they weren't validating previously.
That's interesting when you talk about the type of people and even just the time frame that you reference with between 4 to 5 years. Because if you look at branches of the military, typically you're at a duty station, therefore in a particular role for about that duration of time. And so those people that, were responsible for executing existing contracts, in a lot of cases, they've moved on to their next role and they've taken on that new responsibility. And so that turnover, most of the time there's not a new contract that exists whenever there's a turnover. So the fact that you're having to, in some cases, probably talk to different people for the same contracts.
Yeah.
That makes your role just a little bit interesting.
Yeah, no, and it is interesting. And I think that's where also the civilian workforce of the DoD and government really brings in that level of consistency.
Sure.
As what we called in the Army green suiters rotate. Their time there is only so long, essentially, where some of these processes come into play. And I think that's where so the cyber assessing that I did previously feeds into the cybersecurity maturity model certification. So it's moving to a certification-based contract clause than it is really
processes.
Yeah. So you are getting assessed in order to get that certification, but that certification will kind of stand in for that continuity if people change over from contract. And so, and I think one thing that's good with all of this work that we started back in 2019, from a personnel and resources in this perspective, but it was really putting ownership on the data owners to, do they really need this clause in their contract? Because one, problem, and the DIB would complain about it all the time, is it turned into a boilerplate clause. So it went into every single contract. And that didn't necessarily mean that contract had controlled unclassified information.
Right.
But so it was there, but they're not really processing or handling it. So do they really need that clause in their contract? And then, so it's really putting ownership on those programs. Does this contract truly have CUI? Because there's a kind of cost piece to it that will come back onto the government if extra securities need to be put in place to protect CUI, and they're actually not getting CUI. So it's been a very interesting data identification journey, which is really
sure.
The thing that what I do today is, working with customers, with using Purview for being able to identify that data in order to classify it and protect it. And then, so it's kind of across the whole board, as far as not just at the DIB, but at the DoD, didn't have these types of services or tools previously. So that's the first step in their journey, is to identify, find out what data is important to us and how do we classify that internally. Okay, now let's use Purview to go out
and search for things
and find where all that data is. Yeah.
So I gotta stop. I have to stop you here, simply just because Microsoft, we've done such a good job at Microsoft of naming a singular product and applying it to two different even product sets. A365, to your point, and Azure Purview, that quite frankly can deal with databases and libraries and notebooks, etc. So my whole point in stopping you there is how much of what you're talking about from a data classification standpoint, and when you put the onus back on the data owner, is there really truly an education piece that those data owners then have to go to the relative stakeholders and establish legal processes, like actual retention policies. I mean, all of those things really, we're not talking about like tabular columnar mirrored data where you have Azure SQL versus Cosmos versus vector databases now with the advent of generative AI and, Azure OpenAI and how to actually vectorize your data sources. I'm just talking specifically about data classification. So how much is there an education process, or is there?
I think that's going to be very dependent, right? So if you think about just a generic, we'll kind of go outside of the DoD, we'll just say a DIB, right? They have, a lot of times, especially due to the regulatory requirements that they have, they are required to have like a labeling policy. So, this type of information is considered company proprietary. This kind of information can be just general or public. Similar to like how we have everything kind of labeled at Microsoft, where you have public, general, internal only.
Sure. Classified, et cetera. Yeah. Confidential. I mean,
so a lot of companies and the DoD do have parameters around those kind of generic main areas. And they do say what type of information falls into those categories. But then those are policies are published, and it's left on the data owner and or end user to be able to recognize like, oh, in this email, I am sending controlled unclassified information. So I need to label it. I need to encrypt it. I need to, sign it.
Yep.
So there's a lot that's left on the human element to to label and protect that. And so with a product like Purview, both like starting in M365, but bleeding over to Azure and those data stores, is you have the capability of manual labeling. Like you're like, I don't want to automate anything. I don't trust it yet. And there's like a, crawl, walk, run is
sure. Oh yeah.
The general progression. So you crawl by creating these labels and publishing them. And then they're available for when I write a Word document, I can then classify that. And then you can go like the next step of, policy tips like, hey, this looks like it should be labeled as this. You haven't labeled it yet. Do you want to label it that?
Okay.
And then there's like just straight up automatic labeling where I am creating a document with CUI and it's just going to automatically pop up. This is, it falls into this category, which you've put into Purview to then have the system recognize, and it's going to automatically attach that label and whatever requirements, whether it's headers and footers, encryption, etc., to that document or email. And then that can then extend to your Azure workloads and where your data, like your databases that are stored there, like information that's stored in those databases, those policies created in Purview can then, work across both the M365 and Azure workloads. And so
that's interesting. It makes more sense now, like talking to a compliance specialist about, quite frankly, some of the fine print when it comes to some of our product descriptions and the Learn resources. I think at Microsoft, they do a very good job. So if you're listening to this podcast, Carley and I both work supporting government customers at Microsoft Federal. So when you look at learning how each one of these products work, I think we're talking specifically about Purview. Carley, I'm sure that there's a couple more that you can talk about, Sentinel and Defender coming to mind, but I don't know if you want to get into those today or not. Maybe that's a topic for a later time, but specifically Purview, when you look at the Microsoft Learn resources that are there is a plethora of information, and all of it is product specific. It's not necessarily your scenario specific. So it's great to be able to have these lines of communication out here with people like Carley and with people like myself or some of the other team who put on various webinars and content to reach out and take the time to actually get some deconflicting information and questions answered, et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and that's essentially, that's what I'm here for. And that's my job. I like to say, like, I'm a problem solver. You come to me, tell me what your data related problem is, and I'll show you how Purview can answer and help you solve that problem or streamline your efforts and make it more efficient for you, your IT force, your end users. And I mean, I utilize the Learn documents all the time. And sometimes you just need someone who knows exactly where to look to send you like the link to that Learn document. So
you're right about that.
You're right. There's just so much information out there. Sometimes I don't even know where to look. You know, AI, like I sometimes will use Bing Enterprise if I'm like on a super short, and Bing Enterprise will look through all of those Learn documents for me. And like at least lead me to the right direction.
Yes, they will. There's your assistant right there. You know, I like how you describe the crawl, walk, run phrase, and you hear it talked about all the time. There was actually a Learn series that was done a couple weeks ago about a federal agency, former federal agency CIO, and she had talked about how you don't really come to a meeting with her and ask the question, "What keeps you up at night?" Because it's too broad. So you have to have some education around what's applicable to, the folks, the data owners, for instance. So let's stick to that particular persona. If Carley was going to have a conversation with a data owner who was struggling with not necessarily user classification, but just knowing that their department is migrating from on-prem workloads into Azure, or let's just say more broadly as an industry, they were going to be migrating to the cloud. They haven't necessarily selected which vendor yet they were going to go with. How would you help them plan for the future? And I know this is fairly broad, but just thinking about it from that crawl, walk, run, how would you help them enable their respective agency to say, here's what you're going to need to be cognizant of on the security side? Yes, you can take advantage of the economies of scale and using PaaS services and leverage all the benefits of cloud. But you're going to have this new wrinkle, i.e. security, that you're going to need to be cognizant of. How can you help position that particular?
Yeah.
Put you on the spot, but that's what I'm thinking of.
No, I was actually talking about this like the other night with like a former coworker, as far as I'll approach things. Now, while I focus on data security, data is just like the one piece of it, because you've got your users, so your identities, your endpoints, cloud versus on-prem. That's a big thing. And I mean, luckily, like with Purview, you have the ability to, again, through Azure Purview or even just through like the M365 with the AIP scanner, be able to scan those on-prem workloads. And I mean, this is a conversation we have with many customers, but I mean, a lot of times, maybe the simple first thing to do is to turn on those sensitive information types and use Content Explorer to see where those sensitive information types live. Like that is always that is in the crawl. And that is something that like anybody, any licensing really can do for the most part. You have that capability. Turning on those like social security numbers is like, an easy example. It's PII. So you turn that on and you need to give the system time so it kind of learns what's going on everywhere. And then you can use Content Explorer to see, okay, like in SharePoint and this like one specific site, this one library has 12 documents with 1,000 instances of a social security number. And so then you can see that and be like, okay, well, those need to get locked down. Like, is that a SharePoint site that has permissions to it? Or is that free and open? So really like that identification piece, in Purview, we talk about know your data, protect your data, and prevent your data from leakage or from the insider risk. And so that know your data is that data classification. And I mean, sometimes we think about it like the data identification, the labels, retention policies, records management, like that's not like the sexy stuff people like to talk about. They like to talk about communications compliance, and they like to talk about insider risk management, which are two other elements of Purview. but the foundation to it all is that data classification. And so I always, no matter what conversation I'm having,
Sure.
I start with that.
Yeah, it's almost as if that removing the right click print function as until that goes away, it's almost as if you're always going to have that scenario where somebody shouldn't does. That's really kind of what it boils down to there. I interrupted you whenever we were talking about personas and the crawl phase. I think if we hover over even just that use case for a second, and ask the question, or I want to ask the question, when you think of cyber and the application of the cyber oriented tools that we have, how are they classified differently than just VMs and infrastructure type tools that we have? Like I'm asking kind of an ignorant question just because I don't know how you would orient cyber versus just somebody who would look at low-code, no-code platform tools like Power Platform. Like what's the difference between all of those?
Good question. Am I the right person to be able to answer that? I don't know.
Okay, that's fair.
But I can tell you, or can say that we're getting more and more to a point just in technology in general where security is baked in. Security is part of that conversation, right? Like a lot of updates to regulations in regards to software development, like a secure software development lifecycle, having security baked in. And even at your C-suite levels and your, management, and as you get higher from just that person who is hands on keyboard, security is part of what they're at, like what they're looking for, because they know that, if you add a new tool or a new product or something into your environment, you're now,
introducing risk. Yeah.
And you're changing your attack surface potentially.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And so being able to have security baked into that is why, it's extremely important to think of security from the onset and that's why there's a lot of times like with configuration management or change review boards and those requirements, especially in DoD and DoD adjacent customer.
Defensive agencies. Yeah. Or the DIB.
Defensive agencies or DIB, there is a required change management process. And part of that change management process is security. And I mean, so from before I started working in compliance, I worked in IT in our cybersecurity department of the agency I was working for. And we would get brought in, like you had somebody who was part of that cybersecurity element on the change management board because they would have to be they're baked into that. Because you have the business owners and the lines of business for whatever the company is or whatever the agency is, like they'll say, I need this tool or this is what I want to do.
Right.
And it's something that's on the network, but they're not thinking security necessarily.
No, they're thinking capability. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And so you're starting to see cyber become more of a line of business. So where it is more baked into every day and for the longest time and still in a lot of places, it's a business enabler.
Yeah.
But it's one of those expenses that I, equate to, it's like car insurance. You buy car insurance, not because you plan on getting into an accident tomorrow, but in case you are, you're covered. Whereas because cyber is probably one of the biggest budget spenders, whether it's tools, licensing, or people. And I remember having to go to the mat often at our agency when it came to budget crunching time, because we had the largest budget. So they'd always want to take budget
all the time.
IT.
Yeah.
It's because people did not see it as that type of enabler. And so when I would be assessing, especially as you get to smaller companies where they don't have a robust IT department or, they are aircraft outfitters. So that is their business.
Yep.
That is what they, so they don't understand this IT thing, and there's a new product every week. There's a new vulnerability, or somebody's been hacked, or this, or
oh yeah, software behaves differently, significantly differently than hardware manufacturing.
Right. How do I know what to buy? Or that I buy product A and product B is better tomorrow, and I'm like, well,
yeah.
That's where there are consulting companies, or there are, people that they can turn to, but you can't just not buy or not choose to protect because you don't know.
That's right.
Because that's when you're going to
put yourself in a bad situation. Well, or be in a bad situation.
And it's more expensive if you have if you want to talk about export controlled information, for example, if that gets leaked or into the wrong hands, that is millions of dollars in a penalty for a company.
Not to mention some lives potentially at risk as well.
100%, exactly. And so would you rather lose a contract? So now you're losing your business because you're not secure. I've assessed different companies that, they didn't know what they didn't know.
You're talking about SOC 2 compliance type thing, or is that way different than what you're talking about relative to some of the products? Like when somebody goes through a SOC 2 security, or excuse me, SOC 2 compliance. I'm butchering the acronym.
Compliance assessment type things. So, it's twofold. So Purview does have compliance manager. You've got Defender for Cloud, which also has that compliance aspect to it, which can make the job of you looking internally at yourself 100 times easier than you taking a spreadsheet and then having to go search and what are you doing. It's going to, it's going to definitely tell you the technical pieces of that specific compliance, regulation, et cetera.
Sure.
And where you stand from implementing all of those security requirements. And then even within Defender for Cloud, that's going to give you that multi-cloud aspect. So if you're on-prem, in Azure, in AWS, Defender for Cloud, as long as you have everything set up correctly, that is the one thing, you do have to set it up. You can fix something, it'll show you, hey, requirement 13.4C of the NIST 800-171 is not compliant. You go in, you make that fix. Anything related to that across other requirements is going to update. It's going to update that. So you can see kind of a real time.
It's incredibly powerful.
Stand. Yeah.
Holy moly.
And then and Defender for Cloud can do it across the different cloud workloads.
Sure.
So you can fix it once and it touches all of your different cloud workloads. And it just makes the job so much simpler so that your hands-on keyboard people can prioritize their time better rather than having to spend hours on end going here, going there.
Doing exactly what just was automated. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great, the type of picture that we have all the time is just how would somebody make the decision to go IaaS versus PaaS in terms of a migration, right? So what you just isolated there is just not just the economic benefit, but also the practical benefit of people being able to do what they are paid to do, but then also augmenting that with technology, very powerful technology. All right, so just real quick, for those who do not talk data and or security, we'll keep it tight here. I like to ask just everybody who comes on, what got you started? What got you started in what it is that you do, and why is it that you do continue to do what it is that you do?
All right. Well, this is going to be very interesting, or not interesting, but so I don't have a technical background.
Okay.
I'm classically trained in health sciences. I was in the Army National Guard for about 6 years, and I was a pilot there. I honestly was looking to move from where I was living, and was just looking for a job. I knew Virginia would be a great place, especially with my military training and everything I did there, I'd be able to, have more opportunities. So I actually started out as essentially the executive assistant to the director of cybersecurity. And that's how I learned IT.
Wow.
Was sitting in all of his meetings. And he too was a prior pilot. So he actually would explain cyber to me, like in an aviation manner.
Sure. You have elevation. Don't turn the stick too hard this way because you'll end up in a world of hurt. No, I'm teasing. But
yeah. Or like sometimes to that, like, collective, like power and collective cyclic, things like that. But so I started out essentially as the executive assistant, and we went through a bunch of different as audits and assessments in like my first year there. So I was helping prepare for those. And then I also would have to translate what I would call geek speak tech jargon to layman's terms for our leadership. So I would also learn software development stuff or different like network security things, because they would send me their their summary, and I would go, I'm like, so what does this mean?
Yeah.
If I can't understand it,
in layman's terms,
Admiral so-and-so is not going to understand it. So I learned it that way. And then, compliance and policy is kind of a easy gateway if you don't have the technical background or you are not a technically inclined person. Like I'm not really... it's still sometimes a little much for me. But so I started out then as an ISSO, which is a system security officer. And so managing our different like authorization to operate packages for our different workloads at that agency.
Interesting.
And then with everything for like the NIST 800-171, and our agency was tagged to take on that mission to go out and do these assessments. And so the person in charge of that wanted to bring in my old boss, and he was like, these are the people that I want to come start this program with me. And because he knew how I knew how to write internal policy documentation processes. And so that's how I got started in then assessing DIB customers, and then came to Microsoft. Well, and
talk about a stairs. I mean, that's an incredible. So,
a windy road.
We call that the scenic tour. That's the scenic tour.
Yes.
I like it.
It was a very scenic tour, but so being like, and I always like, and I was telling my aunt this yesterday, like, she's work at a bank. So I had a level of like internet paranoia because she would share all of like the stuff from her IT department to us. And then I joined the Army.
Yeah. Isn't that funny that like those same people that have that, they hand their credit card to a perfectly good stranger, whenever they're paying for their meal somewhere, and they walk away where you can't see them. You're like, really? You don't trust the internet? I'm teasing, but I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
And then the Army increased that. Like, I had, in flight school, they did like a deep dive Google search on me. And, they didn't find like a lot, but I was like, I don't like that they found that. How do I go fix this? So then there was that level of paranoia. And then I joined like IT cyber.
Thank goodness they didn't have Bing Enterprise at that time.
Oh my gosh.
I'm just teasing.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, who knows what you can find with that? I mean, you can find a lot probably. I wonder if they are using it. Now my head, I'm like, I wonder if they are using that now to make things easier. Like, what would that look like for students today?
Oh my goodness. Well, my 12-year-old has already, I think I made the mistake of introducing him to ChatGPT, but at the same time, I think it's helpful for my 9-year-old to go through things like, when he looks at code now, I'm like, you have to right click all the page sources for every site that you're going to, just so you can see what's happening here. And he's like, Dad, I want to play the game because I want to play the game. It's like, yeah, I understand, but you got to understand the pieces in place, my friend. So anyway, that's a whole different topic.
I mean,
so what keeps you doing it? What keeps you doing it?
Yeah.
Then? Like,
well, so, and what I was getting to that, like, so
Oh, I fast forwarded. I apologize. Did I interrupt you like right as you? Okay.
You did not. I sidetracked. I went down a sidetrack and then,
That's all good. We're on the scenic tour again. It's all good.
Exactly. Well, it's what I do. So starting out as that end user, that soldier in the military, downrange, using SIPR, using NIPR, I didn't necessarily even think about kind of cyber security there, just beyond the whole NIPR versus SIPR. And I joke and I say, to me, IT was the S6 and calling, the help desk. That's all I knew of IT before I got, to my last job. But being that end user, protecting them, I served my country in uniform, and then working for the DoD, I saw that as an extension of service because I was serving, the contracts and for that end user. And then the same with those assessments, making sure that our information was being protected by information that the people that the government shared their information with. And I still see that extension even here at Microsoft. While it's not a federal agency, working in Microsoft Federal, and Microsoft as a whole are focused on that mission of securing the end user, right. Securing the warfighter. And so, that's why I love what I do every day, because that is who I'm thinking about. That is who, these companies are building aircraft, handling information for those warfighters. And so helping them stay secure. And even they're users too. They have a ton of information. And securing that is what's going to continue to make the world go around without having big disruptions, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
A big hack or, vulnerability exposed from nation states, because that's who's going after them. So
I was about ready to say that. That's exactly. So you just hit the nail right on the head. People ask all the time about, and first of all, I appreciate the candor and sharing some of what it is that gets you going, and once your feet hit the floor every day, why you do what you do. It being not aware of what another nation state could or will or want or willingly be interested in doing is something that continues to try to keep us sharp on us providing the services to then in turn educate, facilitate, and enable those mission data workload owners to make the right decisions for the future generations and for what could happen tomorrow.
Exactly. And I mean, the IT cyber technology is so dynamic and so fluid. I mean, even in the past year or two with AI and Chat GPT and how that has changed everyday life today in just a short period of time, we have to stay on our toes. And I think there's no room for complacency. And I don't think, anybody that I interact with, both on the internal and on the customer side, get complacent about what it is we do every day.
That's right.
So I think that's also very inspiring to help keep me going. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Well, I appreciate you blocking time, not just for us, but then for those of you who are listening. So just call to action real quick. Somebody who's listening, who has some interest about some of the topics that you had touched, where do they go? Do they go find you on LinkedIn? Should they just check out your email? What's the best way for somebody to connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is probably the easiest way because LinkedIn is open and public. That was the one thing that, they could find for me. I didn't have LinkedIn for many years because of that Google search back in 2010 in flight school.
Understood.
But yeah, so LinkedIn would be the easiest way. And I mean, then we can point you, in the right direction on what you want to know and where to go and what to learn.
Fantastic.
So Carley Salmon at LinkedIn.
Carley Salmon salmon spelled just the same way as the fish is, right?
As
just
the fish.
Just colon and the body part. So I know how that goes. So, well, Carley, I appreciate your time. For those of you who are listening, this is an opportunity. We can always edit this out. All right. So, Carley, if somebody finds you on LinkedIn, where else can they go and take a listen to, some of the more informal discussions that you have that are, educational and fun?
Yeah. So, I love having these informal type discussions. Have a YouTube channel, Cocktails and Socktails. I love good puns. So SOC is SOC, Tales, TALES, where a counterpart and I talk to people in the industry, and kind of like how I learned and how she learned cyber is bringing the ethereal big cyber and making it relevant to everyone, and talking about all sorts of different things that keep us going. So Cocktails and Socktails on YouTube. You can find it linked on my LinkedIn.
Oh, so LinkedIn, there's an indirect
linked
access
on
to
LinkedIn.
There you go. I like it. All right. Well, I appreciate you. So with that, those of you who are not registered for the ongoing Speed Data series, check out the show notes. Make sure that you get educated. Circulate that amongst your office and your respective agencies. And we'd love to chat with you a little bit more. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Bye, guys.
See ya. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Federal Data Talk. Hopefully you've gained valuable insights and inspiration to fuel your journey into the world of data. Join us for new episodes. Don't forget to like and subscribe. That way you don't miss it whenever we release them, for thought-provoking discussions and interviews with industry experts. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.